See if it's streaming. This live stream, I'm gonna explain the problem that I went through, and I think I've managed to find a solution that works, and I tested out, but I'm not 100% sure if it's gonna work through all use cases. But I learned a lot in the process, and I'm gonna share what I learned in this live stream. So first, let me explain the process that I went through and all the stuff that I spent a bunch of time thinking about it. And I didn't want to live stream this because I had to spend a bunch of time thinking in order to figure this out. But pretty much what I'm trying to do is build a blog, and this is the structure, the idea that I had for the blog, which is going to be one main page after this, before this one that I'm showing here, and then this page would be the one that displays the articles. And in this page, the navbar, the footer would be fixed, and then I would have a component called categories. And then the categories would be the stuff that I want to write articles about in the blog. So in my case, the main topics are programming, blockchain, economics, and health and fitness. But then the thing is, for each one of these categories, there will be subcategories and articles. So this is the first problem that I was trying to think about, because it's not clear. I didn't want to leave the layers, let's say, of categories only for categories or articles. I wanted to be able to put articles and categories at the same level. So for example, in this case, when they click on economics, you would go to subcategories, but then I didn't want to just leave subcategories as an option of economics. Maybe programming is a better example. So from programming, you would go for Python, JavaScript, and languages like that. But at the same time, I would want to put articles on the same level as the other subcategories. So an article about something more general about programming that doesn't fit in any of the subcategories that I have there. And then the issue was figuring out how to put them together, because these categories here would be a component in Next.js that has a link component to it. I'm not sure if component is the right word for the name, but the link thing from Next.js. So it would be like this, where I'm linking to the categories based on whatever the current page has in the folder of the articles. So I'm storing the articles in another place, and then I'm making the link into the pages. And then this is where I thought about using getStaticProps, because the way that getStaticProps work, well, I didn't know before that I had to read their documentation several times and think about this to understand how it works. But what I thought at the time is that getStaticProps gets the information. I could get the information from the files of the articles and then use that information to display which categories would be available and which articles would be available at the page that is loaded. But then I had to clarify some stuff about how this works, which I'm going to explain now. And then this is just something else that I didn't think about. So here I made this thing here to explain the levels. That in level 1 I would have folders and files, and in level 2 I also have folders and files mixed up together, and each file is an article, and then the folder would be the subcategory. So it's like what I have in here. This posts contains all the folders that have the files that are all the articles that I'm gonna write for the blog. So here I have the programming, and then in the programming I have the Rust subcategory, and then I have this example files here that are MDX files, which are markdown mixed with JavaScript syntax. And then there's a special library that allows you to do this thing where you can write markdown and JSX components in the same file, and then it understands. But that's not the point of this live stream, so I'm not going to talk about this. I'm just going to talk about the routing stuff and how I fixed it, or how I find out a solution. So the idea was that in these pages, I would get the folders inside of here and the articles inside of here to display on the page. So the first thing that I learned is that you can use this index.tsx file to display something on the root of the whatever directory you are right now, which this case would be programming, because I'm inside of the pages, and then the programming, so it would be the root is the pages, and the programming would be the localhost 3000/programming endpoint. But then if you only have files here, if you're using a dynamic route inside of this programming, then you wouldn't have anything to load on the root folder, the root path, let's say. So let me show with, I think it's easier to show by looking at the website. So in this case, this is /programming here. So if I didn't have the index.js, then I wouldn't be able to load this page. And the way that this dynamic routing works is that you have to put these square brackets, you have to put the name inside of these square brackets, and then this is going to replace whatever amount of pages you wanted to have here. So for example, let's say that I wanted to have an article about JavaScript, then I would do javascript.tsx, and this, whenever the routing gets to this point, which would be programming/JavaScript, you would go to this page here. But if you have dynamic routing and you don't have the page, then the name here inside of the square brackets replaces JavaScript. So in this case, it's going to go to the blank page, and I have nothing there, so it doesn't work. Yeah, I don't have a component because I just made this thing here. But then you would go to this one. So let's say I wanted to have an article about JavaScript and an article about Python. Then I would do python.tsx. And then each one of these files would be, then this would be like equivalent to putting Python here. In which one of these routings, for each one of these routings, I would have to make a page. So what it did is a more efficient way to do this. Instead of having to write a file each time, you just write this file in square brackets, and then it replaces whatever file you would have there. So in this case, if I go to JavaScript, to this endpoint here, or Python, programming/Python, it's going to see that it doesn't have a file that is called Python inside of this programming, and then it's going to go to this page here. So this is the page that is going to load in that case. But that's where it gets extremely tricky, because you have to think about the logic for all the possible pages you would have inside of this page here. And that's where the confusing part gets. That's where it gets confusing. So, I have the... Yeah, I'll talk about this later, but... Okay, so here, let me change to categories. Yeah, so the way that it works is whenever you're gonna accept these params here, parameters inside of getStaticProps, you have to put this function, which is getStaticPaths as well, and I'm gonna explain how this works now. But yeah, before I do that, I'm gonna talk about this index here. So if you don't have the index.tsx, then that's a problem, because there's not gonna be any endpoint for only /programming. So when you reach this page, you wouldn't have anything. And if you only use this file, then it doesn't work, because it only allows you to access endpoints that have another thing after this programming. I don't know how to say that, but you get the point. If you have the square brackets, then you don't have anything for the programming endpoint, and That's the reason why I created this index.tsx, which is allows you to get there. But then this is a problem as well, because then I need two different types of files, and then I need to think about the logic for all the links that I'm going to put here that are equivalent to the categories in these two different types of files. So it gets more confusing, which I figure out a way to solve it, and I'm going to explain later. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, and it's kind of hard to explain because there's so many things, but yeah. So here you can see that I'm not accepting parameters here. And that's the reason why in this page it's not necessary to use getStaticPaths. I'm only using getStaticProps. And the reason for using getStaticPaths is what I'm going to show here. So this is one of the things that was very difficult for me to understand, is that what getStaticPaths is doing is like you're sending all the possible paths to Next.js, and just so it's aware of what's going on. And then each time a user accesses a page, then it's gonna get one of these potential paths here inside of this thing here, and it's gonna use that to load the page. So the page that you're creating that has getStaticPaths as a function is gonna be a template. And then all the possible paths in getStaticPaths are going to load that template when the user access the page. So it's like Next.js is creating a bunch of different pages beforehand, and then it serves one at a time depending on which route of these possible routes the user gets to. So the way you use getStaticPaths is you have to think about what are all the possible routes that the user is that I want the user to get at through this page that I'm creating. So in this case would be all possible routes that are accessible after the programming endpoint. So localhost 3000 / programming / whatever they're going to access. But the thing is, if you put another folder here, then this doesn't work because this only works for the same level. So this would only work for one level deeper, let's say. So if you put Python or JavaScript here, then it would work. But if you put something else like Python and then JavaScript here, then it doesn't work because the square brackets only replaces one level of the thing. And then that's another thing that I'm going to get at after I explain the getStaticPaths there. Oh, go back.
So let's go build that quickly. It's actually
Yeah, so the thing that is tricky here is that maybe this is better to show here, and then I'll go back there. So you're passing all this information through these paths here. So this paths is an array that contains these objects that has these params here that is equivalent to another object. So it's like each one of these things here is equivalent to each one of these paths here. So one little thing that you have to be aware is that the name you put here for the key of this params here, inside of this params object, has to be equivalent to the name of the file here. So it's like the key name is replacing the name inside of the square brackets here. So it's the same name here. So if I put something else here, it's not going to understand and it's going to break the code. So that's another thing that I didn't know about, and I found it hard to find people explaining. And then yeah, and then the information we want to pass as the routes, the possible routes, that should be the value of this key here, which is, in this case is going to be this lug, which is in this case, I'm getting the paths from this function, which I created in another file in the API file here on the API pages. And what this function does is it goes through this folder here or whatever folder you pass. It reads the files and the folders, and then gets I filter pretty much to see if it has an extension of MDX. If it doesn't, then it means that it's a folder, and if it does, it means it's a file, and then I return folders and files. So I can display this later on. So because this information here is going to be passed to getStaticProps, and then through getStaticProps, the information that is returned from this function gets passed to here, which is the component. And then from the component, I pass into this other component, which is the categories, and I use the folders and files to display the links there on the main page. So I'm going to explain more because it gets very confusing. It seems very simple, but it's really hard to think about, at least for me. So where was I? Oh yeah, I was talking about this thing here. Let me see if it is working. Because the thing is I have two different versions, so I don't remember really well this one. Yeah, but I remember it wasn't working if I put because I created two different files here, I created another file in this Rust as well to handle all the routes that would be inside of the other level. But then I had different names for them, and that's where I figure out that the name here has to be the same name that you give the file. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about, so yeah, here a required parameter post was not provided as a string in getStaticPaths. So this error you get because the name here is different. So if post here, it's not going to show any page because I don't have any articles there, but it's not going to show that error. Yeah, so it just shows 404 now because I don't have anything there. But if I go to Rust, then it shows the Rust page. Yeah, so the tricky thing here is that, and this is what I emphasize because it's really hard to understand, is that when you're using getStaticPaths, you're getting all the possible paths, but then you're only going to be able to send one of these paths at a time to the page. So getStaticProps is only going to have access to one of these potential paths that you're returning in getStaticPaths. So imagine this as an array, and the array has all these objects, and each one of these objects, the parameter is this thing here. So the parameter is actually, this is actually the value, but you can destructure the parameter and then you get the file name, and then the file name is going to be equal to this thing here. So like I'm doing here. So when you receive the parameters, you're destructuring here one layer. So you get this thing here, the file name. And then when you destructure again, then you get the value, which will be equivalent to this thing here. That's pretty much what I've seen from other videos that other people do, and that seems to be the way that I should do it. But then this is the problem here that I was facing, because if I get all the information there for all the paths, but I can only use one path at a time, how I'm going to pass all the files that exist in the current file? And this is the tricky part to understand, because you have to think about all the possible different endpoints that you're gonna have here, and what are going to be all the possible articles inside of the endpoint. So depending on which endpoint I am at here, I'm gonna have different articles, because the files and folders inside of the whatever folder I'm analyzing at the time are gonna be different, and that's the problem. Because through here, then this is the reason why I call this function again here, because I need a way to pass all the folders and files to this component here anyway. So before I didn't understand that, because I was getting the things here, and then I was thinking about a way to pass this stuff, all folders and files from this point to this point, but it doesn't work because I can only pass one at a time. So here I have to call this function again and get all folders and paths again. And only in that way I can pass this as props here. So this stuff is just for the articles, is stuff about MDX that helps you read the articles. So I'm not going to talk about this, but this is the props that I'm receiving in order to load on the components that is categories, which is this component here. That is going to show the links in order to allow people to navigate back and forth between categories. Now, hopefully this is understandable so far, because it's really hard to explain. There's so many things and it gets very confusing. So the most difficult part is thinking about how to create one page that works for all the possible situations. And then the last tricky thing, I think, if I'm not forgetting anything, is that, so let's say, for example, here I'm on the, let me pick one. Let's say I'm on the Rust, programming/Rust. So what I'm going to receive here is what posts is going to be Rust. Then I call this function here, and this function is from the API, and it gets pretty much the article, get post from slug. It gets the path, then reads the directory, then uses this other library to get the content of the article and some metadata to display on the page. Then use the mdex source which is another article stuff, and then I get all the folders and files. And then here I had to hard code this as programming, because I was finding it difficult, because this is the thing that I was talking about, how I'm going to put a name here that works. So this is the function that gets all the files and folders that I showed before from this API file. So I think it's this one, get folders and files, yeah, this one. So this function reads a directory. First, it gets the path from this posts endpoint, which is where I have all the posts here. And then I had this coded here on the global level to get the relative path from this posts point. Then I pass whatever directory I'm at. This is the idea that I had at the time. So in this case, I'm on the programming. The page is on the programming level here. And the reason why I did this is because I'm trying to mimic the pages here as the pages here, so it is easier to navigate through the directories and to display them as categories for each page. So the programming is going to contain the same stuff that the programming here has. And I was testing it out, so that's the only reason why I only have Rust here. But then later on I would copy everything and do the same thing for the other ones. Just change the name that I'm giving. So in this case, all of these files will have programming, but then on the other directories would be economics here, because it's a different folder, but it's the same logic. But I couldn't find a way to just pass some variable here or some parameter that depends on these posts, because to find the folders and files of whatever location it's analyzing here. And the reason why is because of the stuff that I talked about the parameters changing every time, and then it becomes really hard to think about a variable that is going to work for all possible situations of different files that you receive through these parameters here, different paths you receive through these parameters. Because I'm using the path to get the folders and files and to get the article. So I received all the folders. I go through this function here that reads the path, which in this case is the programming here, this programming directory, then gets all the folders here and gets all the articles that exist inside of the programming directory. And then after it does that, this props is received in this component, which is this post page component, which is the component of the file. So I have the folders and files here, and then I pass these folders and files into this category component. And then this is the component that I was using to load the information here of the links to do the navigation. But then the other fundamental problem I have here is how I'm going to structure these links so that it works every time on the navigation. Because if you think about it, if they click the link of a file, here I was also passing another props, which is, I thought about it later on, which is the current directory, because I want to be able to access the current directory in order to allow them to navigate to the same directory they are in case they click on a folder. So in this case, they are on the programming folder. Actually, one level deeper, because if they click on the Rust folder, for example, if they click on the Rust here, then I don't want to stay on the programming route here. And if I only put the name, if I don't put this current directory, then it doesn't work, because they would stay, you would change the name for Rust, but it would stay on the same route. And the problem is that the path here for the link has to be different for both articles and folders. Because when you reach the folder, when you click the link for a folder, it has to go one level deeper in order to get the files on that folder to display as a new category. Because the category component is always the same. That's the issue. But the paths are changing all the time. So, and this link component works from the current path you're at. So it's gonna put this relative link here, additionally to what exists here, which is programming already. It's not gonna go from the root endpoint until the relative path. And even if it does, you would still need to have two different types of components of links, one for files and one for folders, because they need to go to different levels. The file needs to stay on the same level, and then because you want to get the article from that file. So if you click on the file and it goes one level deeper, then that path doesn't exist, because it's like you're saying to go. So here I have this reduce.mdx. So if I click on reduce.mdx, the path that I wanted to go is to keep on programming, but just render the article instead of, or replace the programming with the reduce.mdx. Oh, actually not, to go to programming/reduce.mdx, because this name is going to replace whatever exists here. So the path would be like that. But then if I keep the link in the same level, you would go 2 levels deeper. So what I wanted to happen is to go to programming/reduce.mdx. But then depending on the level that I make this, is not going to do this. It's going to go to reduce.mdx/reduce.mdx, because the way that I'm structuring this link here, which is dependent on the props that I'm passing here. Later on I deleted this, but I was passing here equal to programming to whatever directory I want this to display. And then / whatever the category is, whatever the name of the file inside of this programming folder is, which I'm passing as props from this function here. So this function gets all the files and folders, pass as props, and then I'm looping over them, mapping over them to get each specific one, and that's going to be the route, because that's where the folders exist. And then this would generate another path, which I did here, I created, which in this case would be Rust, that I have as an example here. So for example here, instead of posts would be let me do folder, because Rust is the folder. So category here, this props.folders is the folders that I got from this API function, getFolders files, that I passed as props from getStaticProps here. So it's the same folders, which contain the information of all these folders here and this file here. So when I map over them, I'm getting the category becomes one of these folders. And then the link is going to go to the whatever directory it is, which is programming, because I'm passing as a props as well. Where is it? Here. So it would go to programming/Rust. But then the issue is, if I have a file here, then I don't want it to do that. I want it to do something else, because I don't want it should navigate to the current directory, should go one level deeper. I want it to stay on the same directory and render the file. And to be honest, this is still confusing to me because there's so many levels and things you have to think about. So I don't remember really well, but I do remember that because of this thing that I'm mixing folders and files in the same level, the links have to be different, otherwise the logic doesn't work. So maybe this is easier to explain if I go one level deeper here into the Rust directory. Because this was another thing. There was several different times where I had to, it worked on one level, but then once you go levels deeper, it stops working because it gets really confusing on what level is each thing at and how to, because that's the tricky part. How do you get the folders and files for that specific level, and then you create the link for all the levels at the same time? It's really difficult to do. Yeah, but this is roughly what I remember. I'm not 100% sure if it is. Maybe I'm confusing the routes here, but I know that the fundamental logic is the fundamental problem is this that I'm talking about now, which is the files need to have a different link. So one idea that I had was to remove here, and then I did it like this. For the files should be on the same level, but for the folders to go to a level deeper. But then it didn't work as well, because once you go to deeper levels, then you might have files inside of that level. So like if you click on their article on the same level, then it doesn't work because it leads you to a different path, and it didn't work. So this logic it's impossible to figure out, I think. Because if you change here, it's going to work on some levels, but it's not going to work on other ones. And I don't remember the details specifically, so I don't think I'm going to talk about this, but yeah, that's pretty much the problem that I was facing. So now let me think about if there's anything else that I want to talk about this before showing what I came up with, which is a lot more complex as well. And it took me a bunch of time to figure out. Yeah, so another fundamental problem with this is the way that I was doing these folders and files here. Because this makes it more difficult to create the links on the categories folder or component. Also, yeah, the thing that now that I remember, the way that I solved this was to create 2 different components. So I had this categories component, and then I created this post category component. Oh yeah, I think I remember now. So the categories wasn't working because it was working for one level, which is the programming level in this folder. But then I wanted to use the same file for all the levels so that it saves work from having to think about this in the future, about doing different files and putting different parameters here all the time, because then it gets confusing and it's hard to manage if you're gonna write a bunch of articles. It's a lot better if you have the same file, you're just changing the place that they are located in the folder structure. So this is what I was trying to achieve, and this is why it's so hard. Because obviously I could create a different logic for each file and then make it work. But then later on, let's say if you're writing articles and you don't look at this for like 5 months, then once you come back, you have to rethink about everything you did and in order to understand, and it's just not the best. If you have only one file that has the same logic for all the navigation, but you're only changing the directory, then it becomes a lot easier to remember what you did. So here it wasn't working because on this level here, on the Rust level, there was a problem when accessing these folders here, if I remember correctly. And then I had to create another component because when you go one level lower, so you're accessing the file inside of the Rust, it goes one level deeper, but then when you click again, it goes one level above because the link is messed up. if I remember correctly. So if I replace this, let's see what happens. Categories. I don't remember why I removed this current category here. Yeah, looks like it's still working. Yeah, here. Okay. So yeah, the problem is when you get to the last level. So now let me go back. So I'm going to from programming, then I'm accessing the folder Rust, and then I'm accessing the articles on the Rust folder, which are these articles here. And these are the files because remember on the API, that's how I'm getting the files that exist on every directory. In this case, I'm getting access to these files here from this function. And then I'm displaying on this component, which is the categories component. And here I'm linking to the current directory, which in this case is undefined because I'm not passing as a props here. And slash whatever file I have there. So here it still works, I think. Yeah, because the file is one level deeper. So I think that this becomes Rust. I'm not sure actually why this is working here. I think. Oh no, it's because I'm on the another file. Yeah, that's why I'm on the on this file on that level. So I still have programming here. When you're on the Rust level, you're still, because remember the square brackets route, it takes every name from this level and becomes it. So Rust is on the same level as this file here. So this becomes the path and this becomes the file. So when you're on the Rust folder, it's still accessing this file. That's the problem. Now I remember. But then when you click on the files here, then it goes one level deeper, which means that it's not on this file anymore, it's on this file now. So because now you're accessing programming slash Rust, which has this level here, which has this file. And this file is different than this one. So now when you're on this file, and that's why it's confusing, because it's the same name here, but the levels are different. That's why. So if I made another name here, then you would be easier to understand. But then the problem is that I wouldn't be able to mimic the folder structure here because I would have to change this name as well. And it doesn't work. But maybe I'm going to do that for illustration purposes. Should just show what I'm talking about. Let's put Bob here. So now I have to think. Yeah, now is a 404 because you don't have the page here. But if we go on Bob, then it shows whatever you have on the Rust folder here because you're accessing these endpoints. And then when you click here, it doesn't work because now you have Rust and then Bob. And let me think. Yeah, anyway, let me not gonna spend a lot of time because I still have to explain what solution I came up with, and it's gonna be hard to explain. So I think this is clear enough. So let me think if I'm missing anything. Yeah, so here, once you access this level, then it gets undefined because then you're using this other component here. I'm not passing current category. So when I access the file, let me go to Rust again because I changed the name. So once you go to the level deeper, now you're on the other file, and then when you click on this file, you give undefined, you get undefined because you're using the link component on this category here is linking this relative path from whatever path I had before, which goes from Rust. So this is the part that actually this is the part that I have on the link component on the relative path. That's the issue because it doesn't work from the root path. If it worked from the root path, you could always pass the absolute path and then from the root, and then it would work. But because the link works only from the path that the browser is at the moment, then it doesn't work because now if I put a different directory here, then this component is not going to work for the other file, for this level here. So I can't use the same component for different files because when the level of the component changes, the link stays the same, but the level changed. So it doesn't direct the person to the correct path. And then the only way that I figure out to do this is to use the other component, which is this post category. And then I just change the link of the files here and the folders so that I can use this component for whenever I'm at the lowest level of the folder structure. Because then I'm getting the files. It's not gonna do the same thing because when you click on the file, it's only gonna change the data for the article, and it's not gonna change the path of the folder. It's gonna change the path, but it's gonna stay on the same level. I think that this is it for this explanation, unless I'm forgetting something. It's very difficult to explain, so there's a bunch of stuff that I don't remember really well because I spent a bunch of time thinking and navigating back and forth between all these paths and trying to understand what the hell is going on. But yeah. Yeah, so you see now that when I click Bob here, it stays on the current folder because I'm using this other component. So and this component links to the same folder and just changes the name. So Rust Bob. But then if I use the other one, then it goes to the other because it hasn't defined there. And even if I change the name, there's no way to fix that because it's just a inconsistency in the logic. It doesn't work. I tried multiple different ways and it didn't work. So now I think I'm going to explain the most difficult part, which is how do you solve all of this stuff using Next.js, which is very hard for me to do. Yeah, now it works because I changed the name there, but then you have to put a different name every time. And I remember, yeah, I tried a bunch of this different stuff and then it wasn't working in the way that I wanted to work, which is just to use one file. Now let me go to the other branch. So I hope that the getStaticPaths thing is clear because it was also really confusing to me. So just to make sure one more time is getStaticPaths, you need to put all the potential paths that the file is going to have for whatever file you're creating. So in this, actually, let me close this one. Yeah, so in this example, whatever path I want to have inside of this programming is gonna become this file here. So I need to think about all the potential paths that I want the site to have from the programming endpoint, which is this endpoint here. To create a file for this endpoint specifically, you need to create the index.tsx, which is the file that is going to be the root path from that level that you're at, in which this case is programming. And then the other thing to remember is that if you have other files here that are specified, they are going to have preference over the dynamic route path, which is this post. So in this case, if you go to programming/Rust, because I have the Rust folder, then it's going to call this endpoint instead of replacing the file here. Actually, this works only for files. For folders, you have to go from programming slash rust, then slash the name of the file, and then you would go to a different path. But if I had a Rust file instead of a folder, then you would get the Rust file instead of getting the posts file, because the posts is a dynamic route. So the purpose of getStaticPath is to put all the paths inside of the array, and then the parameters is going to contain an object. This object has the key, which is the name of the file that is the dynamic route. And then from the value of the file, you're going to pass whatever paths you want the file to have. But then from getStaticProps, you're only going to receive one of these parameters at a time, depending on which path you're accessing from the page. So you're going to get one from the potential paths you created here at a time, depending on where the user is navigating. And then you can use this parameter, which is the whatever you have on the URL here, in order to change the information you're going to display on the component of the page, depending on that. And then if you want to use links or a component that has links in the page, you're going to run into this problem, which is the problem that I run through, which is that the links work from a relative path from the current path you're at. And this is the problem because it is dynamic. So depending on which level you're at, if you want to create multiple levels, like I was trying to do here, then the link doesn't work, because the link only works if the path you're starting from is always the same. If you want to create multiple different paths for multiple different files and folders, in this case. And there is a way to solve this, which is the way that I'm going to explain now. Attempt to explain, because it's very difficult. But hopefully I can do a decent job and it's clear enough. So now hopefully I think I'm on the right page, the right branch. So let's go over the modifications I did. So what I did was use the catch-all optional parameter or dynamic route. And the way that this works is you put, instead of putting only the name of the file, you put this spread operator before. So these 3 dots here. And what this allows you to do is to not only get all the potential files from this route, from the level of programming here, but also all the potential folders and subfolders you would have from this file. So this, in this case, is replacing the Rust folder from the last example, and all the potential paths that exist after that. So you can imagine that is like simplifying all these paths into one specific file, which is this file here. And if you put the double square brackets, what this allows you to do is to replace that index file as well. So this becomes the index file as well. So it becomes everything pretty much. And this is what I used. But then now you can imagine that it gets a lot more complex, because now there's a lot more potential paths that you have to think about. And you still have the problem with the link. So the first thing that I had to figure out is that if I'm gonna do things like this, then I have to get all the potential folders from this programming here, because I want to have all of them available as the paths. So I need to get all the files that exist inside of here in the getStaticPath to make it available to the page to load each time. And the way that I did this was to change the function there. I found a function online, this get file list that I created on this API, that reads all the files from a folder recursively and then gets all the paths. So when you're using this read_dir_sync here and you're passing this argument, then the files become an object, and you can access properties of these objects. So you can access this is directory to verify if it is a directory or is not. So it's looping through all the folders inside of whatever path you pass here to the function. Then it's checking to see if it's a directory. Then is making, if it is a directory, is making the files equal to the spread operator of the files, which puts all the arrays that are, all the elements that already exist on the files. And then it is also spreading with the recursive call of this function and passing the path one level deep, because this item.name would be the name of the folder. So it goes one level deeper and calls the function recursively if it is a directory, while it's adding everything to this thing here. So this part is adding all the folders that exist inside of these files. And the thing is that this item.name returns the full path, not only the name of the folder. Yeah, it returns the full path. And then this files.push is pushing all the files that exist. So when it's not a folder, it's just going to push the path. The path of the file to these files here, and then returns everything. So this is the function that I'm using. I'm passing this, and this is the other thing that I decided to change, which is I'm not putting the post path in this function. I still have it here on top, I think, yeah. But I'm not using this one anymore, because I want the function to, because I'm gonna call this function from different points, then I want the function to be able to access, to get the full path instead, in order to make it work. So this dir name becomes the full path from the posts, and then whatever directory I'm at on the pages here, which in this case is programming. And then what this is going to do is going to get all the files and folders that exist on this path here for the programming page. Then I'm mapping over them, and then I'm splitting. So I'm splitting the full path from the programming endpoint. Later on, I think I'm going to change this to a variable just so it is easier to paste on the other folders. But now I'm leaving like this, so I'm splitting the full path based on the programming, and then I'm getting the one because I want the relative path from the programming endpoint, which is this endpoint here from the posts. So I only got the relative path for all these folders and files. And then here, what you have to do when you are using this spread operator here, you have to pass the slug not as a string, which would be the case. So you don't pass the path like it is here. You would pass the path as an array. So instead of passing the path here, you have to pass it like this. So in the first case, the value here would be this programming CPP, the path as a string, this value with the path as a string. Or this value here would be the path as a string. But then if we're using the spread operator, then the value becomes an array with the relative paths here. So this is what I'm doing here, because here I'm getting the relative path as a string. Then here I'm splitting based on this thing here. And then I get the array of strings, and then I pass as I create this object, which is called params, which is the object you use on getStaticPath. And then I'm pushing to the paths array, which I created here. So this receives all the possible paths from the relative paths that exist inside of the programming folder. So now on the getStaticProps, I'm going to receive one of those paths at a time. So remember that when I destructure here 2 times, the posts is going to be the array that contains the relative path. So in the case of the programming CPP example, it would be posts would be like this. Or actually CPP. So before it was a string, and then now it becomes this thing here. So now I have to check, because of the difference between folders and files that I talked about before, I have to check if it includes MDX or not, because I want the conditions to be different in both cases. And here I'm making the post file, which I'm going to use to check if it is or not, equal to the last element of post, because remember the last is going to be the file or the folder. If it is a folder, then it doesn't have the CPP extension because I'm getting all the relative path to the end, let's say. But if I'm accessing a file, then the last element of this array is going to have the MDX extension because that's the relative path. So I'm getting the last element here of this array. And also the other thing that I forgot to mention is that you have to pass this as false one time. So I'm doing this here in case you want to use it as the index file that I talked about before. On the getStaticPaths, you need to push this as false. So I'm doing this here. So one instance of the post needs to be false. And then it's going to allow this file to work as work as the index as well. So yeah, so first I'm checking to see if it's not undefined and if it exists. And then I'm making equal to the last element of this list here. And then if it isn't, then I just make equal to empty string. So when it passes here, it means that it is a file. So now I have other function that I'm using to get the post. I don't think I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's not relevant to what I'm trying to explain. But pretty much I had to do two different arrays here, one that contains the path from the file itself, and one that contains the path up to the file but doesn't include the file. And this is this is why because the functions here work in a different way. So get post from slug accepts a different parameter. You need to get the folder and then the other one as well. So there's a slight difference in there that's I don't think it matters too much for what I'm trying to explain. Let me see if I find the file. Yeah, here it accepts this and then it reads the path and then it applies this matter, which is a function from a library that allows you to read MDX files, files actually, then get the content and metadata. So it's pretty much getting the content and metadata for the article. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this check here is because when the endpoint of the file reaches an article, I want to display the article. So I'm doing a condition here to check if this post exists. And if it does exist, then I want to display the article. But if it doesn't exist, I'm not going to display the article. So this is the reason for separating this here, or making this condition to check if it is a file or not. And then on the folders, I'm using this get folders files again to get all the possible folders and files for the current level, which is the same function that I had in the previous example. But this time I'm not filtering them, I'm just getting the full path. Or I'm getting folders and files in the same array. Before I was passing them separated. But now because the logic that I'm going to use on the categories is different, then I decided to do, which I'm going to explain shortly, but I decided to do like this, to leave everything on the same file because it's better. Because my thinking was, instead of separating them here, it's better to separate them on the categories because then it makes the logic easier here. Yeah, and then I return this as props here. So I get all the folders that exist on the current level. And this is going to depend, obviously, on whatever level the API or the page is at, which is going to change from time to time because this can have any folder level and any file level as well. So just to be clear, this gets for the current level, and this other function here gets all the folders and files from the top level, which is the programming. So this gets all the folders and files from the programming, which is this level here. And then this other function gets only the files and folders that exist at the current level, which in this case would be CPP, CSS, and reduce.mdx, these files here. And then I'm passing them as props. And if it isn't a file, if it is a folder, then the path is different as well. I had to make this condition to check if the post exists. If it exists, then I join because I want to get the relative path. And then I want the post path should be whatever the current folder is at, which is the relative path joined from programming and from posts, which is this path here. And then whatever relative path the page is currently at. Because remember, this post is from this params that it receives the current relative path. So this post is the array that I talked about in the beginning. And this array contains the relative path separated in strings of the current file that is being looked at by the user. And then I join them through this to get the relative path. And then this gets the path, and then I call the function as well. And then I pass this as props, and then I pass post as an empty string to indicate that the current endpoint is a folder and not an article. Yeah, and then I receive them as props here. I forgot to delete this, but I'll do that later. And then I pass this to the categories component. And then here I'm making the conditional to check if the post exists. If it doesn't, then I render something else, which in this case I'm just rendering the categories. And I think trying to remember if there's anything else that I need to talk about, or I talked about everything. I want to make sure that I explain multiple times and because it's very difficult to understand, it's very confusing. So it's kind of hard to know if what I'm talking about makes sense or not. But hopefully it is. So yeah, I think that's everything that I wanted to explain so far. And now the logic for the categories and how I figured this out to make the link work for every potential page that exists inside of here. So the way that you do this is with this use router component from Next. And what this allows you to do is to get the current page, to get the current relative path for the page. So depending where the user is at, so let's say the user is programming /Rust. Then the use router, the query parameter of the use router is going to return an object that contains the name of the file. So router.query is going to be an object that contains the name of the file, and the array which contains the parameters of the current file, which in this case would be Rust, if I remember correctly. So through this user router here, you can access whatever relative path they are at, and that's what I used to make the links work for every single path. So the only issue with this is that if you're on the root path, then you get an empty object, and you can also get undefined through this. I don't remember really well in which case this happened, but I know that it happens. So you have to handle these cases. So here I first check if it exists, and then if it does, then I access the first element of that route, which in this case would be this thing here, whatever relative path they're at. And then if it isn't, I put undefined. Then I create another variable here. Then I check to see if this is an empty list, because in JavaScript, empty lists are truthy values. They are not falsy. So it doesn't work just to put posts. So I have to put this thing here. Then I check to see if it's undefined. And I also check to see if it is a file or not. Because if it is a folder, then the link has to be different. And if it is a file, there should be another link. So if it isn't file, then the link is going to be this one, and if it is a file, it's going to be on this one because it's going to stay on the same level. And then you just use this stuff here on the link, and then it works for every page. So I think that's everything that I'm going to talk about. I'm not sure if it's clear or not. There's just a lot of stuff to explain, and it's a lot more confusing than it seems. But this way, so far at least, I think it works on every possible route that I tested. So it doesn't matter where I go, it works. So here I'm going one layer deeper, but if I click here, it stays on the same page. If I go here, it changes, but it stays on the same level, which is what I wanted. And then if I go on the Rust, it goes one level deeper, which has the other files. And then if I click here, it goes one level deeper. But if I click on the other one, it stays on the same level. And then if I go back, it still works. So it seems to be working for every single possible case. And the link changes depending on which level you're at based on this use router thing. Because the difference between this and the other thing that I was doing at the time is that this allows you to have a dynamic linking thing, where the way that I was doing before, it is fixed. Regardless of the user is at the page, at the navigation, the link would be fixed, and it would only depend by the props that I'm passing to the component. But if you use this thing, then the fundamental difference is that you can get the path dynamically depending on where they are at the page, and then you can use that to link them. And this is how you solve it. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I probably talked about everything. And then obviously this allows you to have only one component instead of doing two, because the link is dynamic and it's not fixed and it's not depending on the props that is being passed on this file. Yeah, so I think just an overview to, and then I'm gonna stop here to see what are the main lessons that are learned and what are the challenges. So I think by far the biggest challenge is thinking about how to design one page that is gonna work for all the possible routes, while keeping in mind that you're gonna have to read the articles here and folders from this component, and they're gonna change all the time, which thing you read. So there's three key components here. One is this API file, which is the file we're gonna use to get the functions, to apply the logic for the getStaticProps and getStaticPaths. So maybe I should do something on Skylight Draw to make it easier to visualize this. And so you have the API file, then you have getStaticProps. getStaticPaths. So the API is used on both this, and then the getStaticPaths is gonna go through here. And the reason why you have to access the API on the getStaticProps is because you can't pass all this information you get from the getStaticPaths. You're only gonna pass one at a time here. So here, if you got 100, let's say you got 100 possible paths from a function that you have on the API. Here, you're only gonna pass one at a time, and that's the problem. So if the logic depends on the whatever paths you're getting, you're gonna have to access. I couldn't find a way to make it work, so I only call the API function one time. I think you need to call it on both of these places because of this difference. So the logic, the fundamental difference in the logic that of the API function, depending on which part of the code you're at on getStaticProps or getStaticPaths is going to be that getStaticPaths is the logic for the current file. And then getStaticPaths is going to be the logic to get all routes that you want the user to have access from the endpoint of the dynamic page you're building. And then obviously this getStaticProps is going to go to the components. And then from the components, you're accessing another component which has the link. So the main issue is that the link has to be dynamic because of this flow of information here. So because you can access all the potential paths from getStaticProps, if you do the link based on a static path, it doesn't work because depending on the level of navigation, the link is going to break. So you have to use router because the link has to be dynamic. So I think that's the main fundamental things here that I learned through this. And then obviously, if you want to simplify, then you use the 3 dots there, which allows you to have all potential files and folders, not only files. And if you only need to access that endpoint, then and not other deeper endpoints, then you use the file, the dynamic route. And you don't use the 3 dots, which is the catch-all optional parameter. Oh, the other key difference is that you have to use array as the parameters value and using dots. Example, what's string when using the normal one. And then the other key point is that the value of the key inside the parameters are the params object needs to be equal to the file name. Yeah, so I think this is the first one. This is the second key thing. That's when you're using 3 dots, you pass an array, not a string. Then the API, the way that the API works is the third stuff that I learned, I think. And this flow of the getStaticPaths, where the purpose of getStaticPaths is to get all the paths, and the purpose of getStaticProps is to get the specific prop from the specific page that is one potential page of all the possible paths you have from the getStaticPaths. And then from the information of the specific page, you're gonna go and do things on the component, which depends on that. And this is the challenge you're gonna have, because you have to think about all the potential routes you're gonna have and all the potential data you want to display on all those routes. And then think about how to make it so that the logic on the getStaticProps work to get that information regardless of all the potential routes you have here. So you have to think about all the potential routes simultaneously and create a function on the API that is going to give you the data based on those routes at one single instance at a time. And then the final thing that I think I learned is that when you're using the component, the link inside of one of these components, or inside of one thing that you're going to render in the page, and it is inside of another component, then you have to make the link dynamic and dependent on the use router. Because if you do the link statically and only dependent on whatever files and folders you have on another place that you're trying to get the data from, then the link is going to break depending on which level it is, because it is impossible to make it so that it works at one level, but and all the other levels at the same time. If it works on one level, then it's going to break on the other one because the link doesn't change. And you can't make it work because it's inside of a component. So the file is going to change all the time, but the component is going to stay the same. So the only alternatives you have is to either create multiple components or use dynamic routing with use router. So you either create multiple components or you use the parameters in the URL dynamically from use router and then create the logic there in order to be able to link regardless of where you're at. And I think that's pretty much it. I think it was confusing in the beginning because I didn't remember everything that I think about, and there's so much stuff that I thought about to make this work. So yeah, but hopefully this is clear enough to help people understand if they face the same problem. Yeah, but maybe I'll make more videos about this in the future once I have more experience. I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm probably gonna come back later to work on the theme for this stuff here. And I'm gonna commit all these changes and then merge this with the other branches. So yeah, probably gonna be back soon. If not, then probably tomorrow or some other time. So, and next thing I'm gonna do is work on the theme of this blog here.